Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in linguistics. I am Pramod Pandey, Professor, Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. We have come to the third module on prosodic phonology. In this module, we will be concerned with discussing the issues of prominence at the phrase level and of its relation to intonation. Basically, we'll ask the following questions. What are the common patterns of phrasal prominence and accentuation in languages? And what are the implications for classifying the intonation of languages? We have an example on the screen of an intonational representation which was produced in the earlier module. Take a look at it. As you see here, that the intonation pattern is divisible in terms of entities that go along with phonological phrases. So in this sentence from Assamese, we'll read it like this. Romain mor ghoroloy goisile. Romain to my house had gone. Now these are also the three phrases. As you can see there, that there is a change in the tone, intonational patterns, which is somehow tied up with the phonological phrases. So phonological phrases provide the basis for intonation in languages. This is an illustration of that fact. Further, we can go into more details and see how, and this is a representation from Hayes and Lahiri, see how the various phrases are seen very clearly in terms of the various rises and falls of the intonation. Again, we have a representation of both the phonological phrases and the intonational phrases in the same graph and figure. On the upper side, we have the representation for phonological phrases in terms of grids, and on the lower side, we have the tonal structure of the phrases given here, reproduced from Hayes and Lahiri work on Bangla intonational phonology. Phonological phrase, which we discussed in the previous module, is, as we said and repeat, related to intonational phonology. In prosodic phonology, we use phrases such as phonological phrase, major phonological phrase, minor phonological phrase, when it comes to discussing the structure of phonological phrases. So many have been proposed, many of these terms have been proposed for different languages. Languages here vary. Is there a single term that can be used for all languages? It's been generally found that not really. There are languages which have phonological phrases as such, but there are also languages such as Korean, and even Bangla has been shown to be like this, which has both major phonological phrases and minor phonological phrases. So depending on languages and their phonological structure, we have different categories proposed for phonological phrases. Also, for intonational phrase, similarly, we have different terms used according to what the phonologist thinks characteristically describes the nature of the intonational phonology in the language. Thus, we have had terms such as accentual domain for Indian languages such as Hindi. The so-called phonological phrases form accentual domains, or they form accentual phrases. And then there may also be, as we said, intonational small IP, which goes with minor phonological phrase, and IP, which goes with intonational phrase as such. So there is minor intonational phrase and major intonational phrase. Depending, as we said, on the languages, we have to be familiar with how the system works. We propose one of these categories to be relevant to explicate the phonology of phrasal stress, tone, and intonation in languages. In the present module, we will begin where we had left with regard to the phonological phrase. We take a look at the prominence pattern in phonological phrases. See, languages here differ, it seems, on the different parameters of prominence in phonological phrases. Please remember, and this is a caution you should take, when we talk about prominence above the word, that is within the phonological phrase or within an intonation phrase, please remember that we can only talk about the prominence in sentences that do not have any context. Sentences can have various prominence patterns depending upon context. Thus, we saw the sentence, "The new book is a useful resource." Now, depending on the context, you can put prominence on any of the words. You can say the new book is a useful resource. That is, it's not something ordinary. Or the new book is a useful resource. I'm not talking about the old book. Or new book is a useful resource. That means I'm not talking about a new magazine or movie or something else. So these are the ones which provide the context. That is, when I say new book, that means the context is the book and not something else, etc., etc. So please remember that given context, the prominence can be put anywhere. But in neutral context, prominence tends to be put at a given, let us say, a word in a certain phrase. So what we call this all new phrases, all new sentences. That is, the sentences which are assumed to be produced new, without any context in them. If we keep that in mind, then we will find that we can restrain our response and reactions to the various productions that we hear. We may think that, oh, I say it differently, or it can be said differently. Yes, of course it can be said differently. But the point is that every language has its neutral prominence pattern, and that's what we can talk about here. When it comes to putting prominence anywhere else, that's known as focus, and focus is something that needs to be discussed in detail, and somewhere at another point we can do this if we have the time in the present module. Now, prominence pattern now at the phrase level. So we have prominence pattern at the phrase level, prominence pattern also at the intonational level. What do we need to talk about prominence pattern at the phrase level? Essentially, and this is a part of universal grammar, that there seems to be a parametric variation in the prominence pattern in languages. Basically, there are only two prominence patterns that have been pointed out by earlier intonation phonologists, prosodic phonologists, and these patterns are these. Prominence is either left dominant or right dominant. What do we mean by this? Given two words in a phrase, it is either the case that there are languages which always put the left word as the more prominent, as the dominant one, or the right word as the dominant one. We have, interestingly, these two languages which are used commonly in India, namely Hindi and English, having these two different dominance patterns. When we say English, what we mean is the English spoken by its native speakers. We will see how Indian English is actually affected by the Indic languages, and the dominance pattern differs in Indian English from native English. So now, to illustrate the different dominant patterns which are parametrically variant in Hindi and English, we have examples on the screen. As you see, were expressions such as mota chashma is thick glasses. When we translate into English, and if we look at the prominence pattern in English, it will be thick glasses. So we have mota chashma, see, thick glasses in Hindi and thick glasses in English. Now, in Indian English, it's like Hindi. So, it's most Indian English speakers, especially say those speakers of those varieties whose mother tongue has left dominant stress, such as Hindi and Punjabi. And interestingly, as we will see, that there are many Indic languages which are left dominant in their pattern. So, in Hindi and in most varieties of Indian English, we hear this as thick glasses. So, Hindi English, Tamil English, Manipuri English, Bangla English, most of these Englishes have this production thick glasses rather than thick glasses. Now, there seems to be some reason for all this. The reason seems to be that in Hindi, it is the complement which is considered to be more prominent than the head. So, these adjectives like thick or mota, or we can say with regard to adverbs and verb relationship, we say slowly, walking slowly. Slowly is the complement modifier and walking is the, shall we say, the main verb. It is slowly which is more prominent than walking. And it seems that there is some kind of a relation between dominance pattern and what is new information. So often the complements give the new information. So when we say mota chashma, then it is mota which gives the new information about the glasses, and glasses are already assumed, that's given information. So many of these factors determine the prominence patterns in languages. To sum up this discussion, we would say that a language such as Hindi is left dominant and a language such as English is right dominant in terms of prominence pattern at the phrase level. Look at the illustration of the prominence pattern of a sentence from Hindi. The sentence is Malini kafi thak kar aayi. And we will see here that that in this sentence, the representation of the two phonological phrases is Malini and then Malini kafi and then thak kar aayi as one of its productions. And in both the phrases as shown, that the grid mark shows that between the two words it is the left word which is stressed. So Malini, and then we say thak kar aayi, we say thak. So this is an example of a left dominant prominence pattern at the phrase level in Hindi. At the intonational phrase level, so we have phonological phrase which we saw, and now take a look at the intonational phrase level dominance pattern illustrated here. To reproduce from the previous one, we notice that the IP level, the intonational phrase level, what we have is between the two phrases, it is the second phrase, which is also the final phrase, which has the strongest prominence, accent. So it is Malini kafi thak kar aayi. We don't say Malini kafi thak kar aayi. If we say Malini kafi thak kar aayi, that means it is now focused, and their context is that Malini and not somebody else which came after having been much tired. So intonational phrase prominence is in terms, it's left dominant, but it is on the final phrase. And this is very interesting. This seems to be a very common prominence pattern in world languages. So let's say if we have to explain the prominence pattern in English and in Hindi, in English, since it is right dominant, so within a phrase it's always the rightmost word, content word which is stressed. Now, but the intonational prominence pattern is the same in English and Hindi. In English, the final phonological phrase is the most prominent, and in Hindi too, the final phonological phrase is the most prominent. However, Hindi being left dominant is not the final word, but the leftmost word in the phrase is final, is strongest. And in English, it is being right dominant, so the last content word is the one which is the most prominent. So this way we can see that the prominence patterns in languages get very easily explained in terms of phrasal prominence and intonational prominence patterns. We have, just to illustrate that the left dominant pattern in phrases is very common in Indic languages, we have the examples given on the screen. Languages such as Assamese, Malayalam, Meitei, Sora, Tamil, they all are left dominant systems. And the intonational prominence pattern has also been shown to be of the same type, that is, the final phrase in an intonational phrase bears the strongest stress. Languages such as Assamese, Malayalam, Meitei, Sora, Tamil, all have been shown to have this kind of pattern. Bengali, Hindi should be added, but these are only additional which have not been discussed. So we can now put these the phrasal stress rule and intonational phrase stress rule for languages such as Hindi, Bangla, and many of those Indic languages shown here as you see on the screen. Phrasal stress rule, the first phonological word in the phonological phrase is the most prominent one, is given the greatest prominence, and intonational phrase, the last phonological phrase in the intonational phrase bears the highest prominence, is the greatest prominence, is the one which is stressed. Now, interestingly, these rules of stress at the phrase and sentence level are also, that is intonational level, are also found in not only some of these Indic languages, but in a large number of languages, such as Persian. So these rules have actually been taken from the statement of rules for Persian, as you see mentioned with the detailed reference on the screen. Now, is the left dominant, right dominant pattern has anything to do with other phenomena processes in languages? There is one which has been interestingly found to be explainable using left dominant and right dominant pattern. It's been shown that a language which is left dominant language, now in such a language, the process of cliticization is of the enclitic type. That means a word which belongs to the following phrase can be taken as a clitic in the preceding phrase. So this is encliticization. Procliticization is that a word which belongs to the left phrase goes to the right phrase. So that's the procliticization. For example, in Hindi, when we say Ram ek acha ladka hai, Ram ek acha ladka hai. Now, in fast speech, if I have to pause, I can say Ram ek acha ladka hai. Now, ek goes with acha ladka in the syntactic phrase. But because Hindi is left dominant, so Hindi tends to take a word from the adjacent phrase into its own, and that's how the ek is encliticized in Hindi. Ram ek acha ladka hai. Whereas in English, it can be the other. You say, he said, what did he say? That he is not coming today. Let's take this as a sentence. He said that he is not coming today. But in actual fast speech, you can hear people say, he said that he is not coming today. Now, what is this that? That goes as the complement, sentential complement of the following phrase clause, but it is procliticized in the sentence. Now, something to be said about sentence final phrasing. We have already discussed it to some extent in the previous module. What we notice in the sentence final phrasing is that often the final phrase, which is a full, say, let's say, verbal phrase in a language such as Hindi, somehow gets incorporated into the phrase that is preceding, that is the adjacent phrase. We call this restructuring. Now, restructuring takes place mostly at sentence finally, so that we have phonological phrases, two phonological phrases making up a single phonological phrase. I have here on the screen, we have here on the screen examples from Hindi. Let's say we have this sentence, Kapila ne apna nivedan patra der se post kiya. Now what we see is that these four phrases, Kapila ne apna nivedan patra der se post kiya, there are three basic phrases which are also called accentuation domains. Now, but in actual reality, in fast speech, you may hear speakers say something like, Kapila ne apna nivedan patra der se post kiya. And you see this in the graph, in the pitch pattern graph on the screen here. So what you see here are three phonological phrases finally, and three accentual domains. Say, Kapila ne apna nivedan patra der se post kiya. Now to exceptions to left dominant and right dominant patterns. Is it the case that a language which is left dominant or which is right dominant is always left dominant and right dominant? Are there no instances of exceptions in them? In fact, the answer is no. There are exceptions to the dominance pattern in these languages. We sometimes find that a language which is left dominant, in such a language, it is not the leftmost word but the rightmost word. Maybe accented is the one which is most prominent. But there are reasons for this change, for this exception that must be considered. What kinds of factors may influence the formation of exceptional phonological phrases with left dominant patterns having right dominance or right dominance patterns having left dominance? The reasons are, number one, focus. That is, it is quite possible that given a phonological phrase, it is the right one which is focused, and so the left one naturally is no more dominant. For example, in English, we can say right dominant, Ram's father, but you can also say Ram's father. When you say Ram's father, it's one phonological phrase, but it has become left dominant now, although normally in English you will say Ram's father. So focused utterances will show that the dominance pattern may not be followed, and there may be exceptions to this. As we said, parametrically there are only two possibilities. Either the left one is dominant or the right one is dominant. For Hindi as well, we can see, we translate Ram's father as Ram ke papa. So if you have normally Ram ke papa ghar aaye the, you can say Ram ke papa ghar aaye the, where Ram ke papa makes one accentual domain, one phonological phrase, but it is the right one which is more prominent than the left one. That's one. That is, focus can lead to exceptional utterances. The second reason for exceptional utterances or exceptional prominence pattern could be the attachment of function words in these phrases. Thus, it's often the case that there are determiners in languages which get attached to content words, but the determiner, if it is preceding the content word, then it is not stressed, but the right one is stressed. For example, in Hindi, when we say that something like mere papa, my father. Now, it's rare for mere to be stressed unless it is focused. Normally, we say mere papa, uske, uska ghar. Instead of saying uska ghar sounds focused, that is his or her house, not somebody else's. Similarly, we say mere papa, that means my father, not somebody else's. So the neutral pattern is, in these cases, with determiners will be right dominant, mere papa, uska ghar. So these are at least two prominent reasons for there to be exceptions in the phrasal prominence patterns in languages, and similarly there should be some also for intonational prominence. The fact that final phrases are restructured with their adjacent phrases is a phenomenon that has been widely discussed in the literature. One thing that can be added to the explanation, to the discussion here, is that there are two factors which play an important role. One is constituent structure, that is the syntactic structure of phrases, and the other is metrical structure. Now, to give an example of the metrical structure is the principle that has been formulated called uniformity. What is uniformity? Uniformity is something like the length of phonological phrases. It's been proposed by the phonologist Guinea in 1993, and many others have gone on to accept it. What it says is that phonological phrases, in order to be restructured, two phonological phrases, in order to be restructured into a single phrase, they should be of the same metrical strength. In languages such as Hindi, it may work differently. It may say, for a phrase to be incorporated into another phrase, it must have smaller metrical length than the preceding phrase. Thus, in Hindi, we have examples such as, you see them on the screen, tooti hui purani kursi. Now, broken old chair. Now, when you say tooti hui purani kursi, we say them as two phrases. Tooti hui purani kursi. But if we remove the word purani, that is old, from it, then the phrase containing only kursi tends to get incorporated into the leftmost phrase, so that tooti hui kursi, there being only one accentual phrase, seems to be possible. But tooti hui purani kursi is not possible, because these are two phonological phrases and it's difficult to pronounce them as a single phonological phrase. Now, phrasal accentuation. So we are moving to intonation. Basically, we said intonation deals with phrasal accentuation, that is what kinds of accentuation patterns are found in phrases, and which of them is chosen as the nucleus. Now, languages have various types of patterns. That is, we may have languages in which each phrase has a pattern such as HL, patterns such as LH, and etc. Different kinds of contours are found to characterize the accentual domains of phonological phrases in different languages. We will not go into great details. You take a look at the module for illustrations of the different types. We have here on the screen the illustration of some Indic languages and some South Asian languages. Rather, to begin with, take a look at Nepali, where we have a sentence produced which means the north wind and the sun. This is reproduced from the paper presented by Khan 2016. It says, the sentence in Nepali means Uttari Batas Surya, Uttari Batas Surya, Uttari Batas Surya. So Uttari is one phrase which is rising, LH, and then Surya, again LH, and then finally there is a low tone boundary tone, which is with which the intonational contour ends. So the typical pattern here is the rising contour. This seems to be the general pattern in most Indic languages. As we can see, there is a graph reproduced from Keen 2013 on Tamil, where you find the same pattern. So you have phrases, words occurring as phrases, they all begin low and go high, begin low and go high, and finally in declarative sentences there is a low boundary tone, so they come low. This in fact is the general pattern in many Indic languages. As I said, and to repeat, other languages have different other patterns which have been discussed in the module. And finally, the discussion of intonation types, with which we close the discussion here. There has been a proposal for a typology of the intonational systems of world languages. Among others, two are prominent, especially because they are relevant to Indic languages. These are intonational type of languages and phrasal type of languages. So English, for example, is an intonational type language, so is German, and so are German and Arabic. But we also have languages such as French, Bengali, Hindi, and most other Indic languages which have been proposed to be of a kind called phrasal intonational languages. Now, this has been proposed recently by Ferry in a model of the discussion of Bangla, Hindi, Malayalam, Tamil, and so on. What the phrasal intonation language means is, that is the way it is defined, is that these phrasal intonation languages do not have lexical stress on their own. The stress and accent in them is dependent on these accentual domains, phonological phrases, and they have to deal with the boundaries, that is left boundary and the right boundary, phrasal boundaries, beginning and ending. Thus in Hindi and most Indic languages, you begin low and then you go high. Both are considered to be determined by the phrasal boundary. Now, as compared to this, we have intonational languages where this is not the case. Different phrases have their own accentual pattern, and the stress in them is dependent on lexical words in isolation, and thus they are quite different both in perception and in production. With regard to the classification of Indic languages, phrasal languages, there have been certain proposals which go against this distinction, but there seems to be some merit in the claim that Indic languages are different in intonation than languages such as English and Arabic and German. So the reason given for the not accepting the phrasal intonational label for Indic languages is that Indic languages are not all of the same kind. For example, take a look at the intonational pattern of a sentence such as Hindi on the screen. See, the sentence is तलवार ने अपने घर का furniture बेच दिया. Look at the pitch track of the sentence, and the range of the pitch change. See, the low and rise difference is very, very small in Hindi. As you can see here, you can sort of calculate and figure and see what the range is like. So we have तलवार ने अपने घर का फर्नीचर बेच दिया. So we have 4 phrases. तलवार ने अपने घर का फर्नीचर बेच दिया. Now As we said, as it seems, it reads like something like a wave without too much of variation at the low and high pitches. However, this cannot be claimed to be the general intonation pattern of all Indic languages. Take a look at the pitch pattern in a sentence from Bangla. So we have here the pitch track for a Bengali sentence taken from a website. In this sentence, Parish Janan Petroler Mulyo Briddhi Hole Sadharonoto, etc. Sorry, in this sentence, which says Parish Janan Petroler Mulyo Briddhi Hole Sadharonoto Dollarer Dam Kome. Now, take a look at the variation, the pitch and the pitch tracks. There is such a vast difference between the low level and the high level of the tones that it seems quite markedly different from the pitch track in a language such as Hindi. So this issue of the all Indic languages being of the same type, that is phrasal type, is something that needs to be looked into and examined. More work is needed in this area, but that's a fascinating area. So thank you. We have come to the end of the discussion of prosodic phonology. We began with an introduction to the theory of prosodic phonology, and then we looked at the very interesting issues of how do we decide about the need for a certain phonological category in the theory of prosodic phonology. We followed this method of motivating each of these categories. Hopefully you have found the discussion interesting, and you will go on to read further in this area. There's a lot to read and think about. Do carry out the exercises that are given at the end of the modules. Thank you.